Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, first of all, to our panelists, Katherine Zimmerman and Zelin, for taking time out of their busy schedules to talk all things terrorism. They are foremost experts in the field, and I'll let them introduce themselves here in a minute, but let's take some time and thank ACTRI and Ardian and for putting this on and partnering with the Special Operations Association of America. Ardian, tell us why we're here.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that. So greetings, everybody, participants, esteemed panelists as well. My name is Ardian Shajkovci. As Dave said, I'm director of the ACTRI. This is the first of the three-part series of webinars, Interlinkages and Partnerships for Security, where we have teamed up with the Special Operations Association of America and ACTRI. In today's session, we'll attempt to delve into some of the complexities of the now what we know protracted Syrian conflict, terrorism in the region, and beyond, the shifting geopolitical dynamics, including in light of the ongoing Ukraine-Russian conflict, as well as assess implications for the US foreign and counterterrorism policy more specifically. The Syrian conflict has persisted for far too long, coupled with the rise of extremist and terrorist groups continuing to contribute to a wave of instability in the region. The shift in geopolitical dynamics in the Middle East, specifically the involvement of Russia and China, continue to redefine the balance of power and influencing cause of events, as we've seen in most recent years as well, demanding further attention. Lastly, in addition to the regional dynamics, one must not overlook the impact of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war on the counterterrorism policy in the Middle East, generally speaking. In this regard, it is very essential to emphasize the importance of robust research, pooling of knowledge and resources, and effective partnerships and collaboration to address these complex issues. With that said, again, we're very grateful to the panel for their presence and contribution today, and we hope that it will serve as a catalyst for constructive exchange of ideas for this webinar, but also beyond as well. So a few housekeeping rules. This is going to be a open format discussion, if you will. We'll have panelists proceed with about 5 to 10 minutes opening remarks, followed by a Q&A session. Again, we're not going to be turning this into a one-sided panel discussion. It's open to discussions. Panelists are welcome and encouraged to actually contribute to the topics they deem important and pressing for the purpose of a discussion as well. So without further ado, we'll start with our first panelist, and I already have your bios with. If you don't mind, Dave, I could just go ahead and introduce maybe Katherine and the rest as a panelist. Thank you. So Ms. Katherine Zimmerman is a fellow at American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on the global Salafi jihadi movement and counterterrorism. She also studies the Al-Qaeda network and related trends in the Middle East and Africa, including Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula and Yemen, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and Al-Qaeda in the Sahel. She's also an advisor to American Enterprise Institute's Critical Research Project. Mr. Zimmerman has testified before Congress about the threats to U.S. national security interests emanating from Al-Qaeda and its networks. In addition, she has briefed members of Congress, their staff, and U.S. military, diplomatic, and intelligence community personnel. Her commentary and analysis have been widely published, including in CNN, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, Fox News, The Hill, The Huffington Post, The Wall Street Journal, and others. So with that being said, Katherine, the floor is yours.
Super. Thank you, Ardian, and thanks to both Aktri and SOA for having this panel today. I think it's important to look at the issues as well as how some of the challenges in the Middle East connect to the other issues that the United States is trying to address. So as I was reflecting on both the theme of the conversation today and my research, I think there are a couple key points that I want to make. And I think the first one is, as we look at the counterterrorism threat, yes, the direct threat to the homeland, to the US and to Americans has decreased, but we still see a significant network, both from the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, that crisscrosses the Middle East into South Asia, as well as, of course, across into Africa, where it's growing most rapidly due to security conditions and the challenges in responding to those conditions currently. And while those threats and threat groups are expanding, it means that there is an opportunity in the future for the groups to refocus their energies on the United States or on Europe. So similar to the pattern that we saw coming out of the Islamic State in Iraq in 2014, where all of a sudden it launched its networks at Europe, and the European countries experienced a massive wave of terror attacks, 2015, 2016. The challenge that I see is that even as we are moving forward in an era where resources toward counterterrorism have been reduced due to the emphasis on the strategic competition with China and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, as well as the many other challenges the US is trying to address today, including the long-term challenge of changing climate conditions, which are helping drive some of the conflicts. The resources for counterterrorism have started to decrease. So there's been a shift because the United States is no longer as focused on counterterrorism, and because the direct threat is no longer present. And behind that is the core challenge that we face today, which is even back when we had fully resourced our counterterrorism operations, they were only effective to a certain degree. They were incredibly good at eliminating the immediate threat, at disrupting networks, at taking back the terrain. But as the story gets told in the various theaters in Yemen, in Iraq, in Syria, in Somalia, and we're watching it right now inside of Mali and elsewhere, when the pressure is released, we see these groups reestablish themselves simply because the US counterterrorism approach doesn't prevent the groups from reconstituting. So the US is still trying the same approach with fewer resources, which means that we actually are introducing a lot more risk towards our counterterrorism activities in general. And I would say, as we are applying the counterterrorism approach, yes, it seems surgical, it seems like it's low resource and a good idea to have this over the horizon posture, the idea of being able to effectively base outside of the countries and engage inside of Iraq, Syria, or elsewhere, recognizing that we do have troops on the ground there, to be able to contain the threats. But it doesn't advance other American interests. So, the key challenge that I see facing the United States today with regard to some of the Middle East activities is that we are looking at threat groups that are still incredibly focused on the Arab world. They're awaiting opportunities to re-expand. We're relying on an approach that was resource intensive, effective in the short term, less effective over the medium term, and certainly not effective over the long term. And it is not advancing American interests with regard to our partners in the region. Yes, their demand is for counterterrorism, certainly. But as we kind of look at what else the United States can be doing, we can be having a much more stabilizing impact if we were to reframe how we were to address these groups on the ground, if we were to look at the security conditions and also understand how the socioeconomic and political conditions are driving some of those security challenges. I think as any watcher of the region can note, the Syrian conflict is not over yet, and there are still conditions on the ground that are allowing the Islamic State to come back, in addition to other challenges up in the Northwest that Aaron can talk to at length much better than I can. The same thing in Iraq, where we still have a disenfranchised population, and where we've seen clear military and security-based objectives achieved, but we actually haven't addressed the underlying issues. So, I think as we're looking at the top line challenges for the US in managing all of these complex challenges across the board, it's really going to be, in my opinion, determining a new approach to a long-term terrorism problem for the United States that actually goes to the source of the conflicts themselves and the ability and the opportunities that those conflicts create for Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State to strengthen, and works to address them within a framework of competition, within a framework of advancing American interests rather than just countering the terrorist side. So I know you want this to be a discussion, so I will end there, but I certainly have a lot more to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. I appreciate that. Very, very insightful points. Jotting down a lot of great points. Looking forward to a Q&A session. Next up is Dr. Aaron Zelin. Dr. Zelin is the Richard Burrow Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, where he also directs the Islamic State Worldwide Activity Map Project. Dr. Zelin is also a visiting research scholar in the Department of Politics at Brandeis University and founder of the widely acclaimed website Jihadology. He's author of the book Your Sons Are at Your Service, Tunisia's Missionaries of Jihad, published by Columbia University Press, which was nominated for the Neame Memorial Book Prize in 2020. Dr. Zelin is currently working on a second book tentatively titled Heart of the Beliefs, A History of Syrian Jihadism. Dr. Zelin's research focuses on Sunni jihadi groups in Syria, North Africa, Afghanistan, as well as trends of jihadi governance, online mobilization, and foreign fighting. He has also conducted field research in Tunisia, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, and Turkey. Thank you, Dr. Zelin. Your floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it and looking forward to this robust discussion. Of course, talking for 5 to 10 minutes, it's hard to encapsulate everything. So just like Katie, I'm looking forward to getting into these issues more in the coming hour. So I think one of the things to recognize that many people didn't think of at the time when we're looking back at the Syrian conflict is that in many ways it was already sort of a strategic competition, even though most people have viewed the Ukraine-Russia war as sort of the return of sort of the strategic competition going on in the geopolitics of the world. If you look at the Syrian war in many ways, from the beginning, there are outside players trying to jockey essentially for influence, whether from global powers or regional powers. And therefore, I think it's important to reframe that, even though, of course, there was a legitimate uprising against what the Assad regime was doing. One of the things to think about too when we're talking about these issues, because one of the problems I've had with a lot of discussions over the last few years when people have tried to, of course, pivot to focusing on China, Russia, et cetera, is that they're bifurcating this issue of power competition and counterterrorism. But if you actually look at the history of the Cold War, there was a lot of terrorism that intersected with the competition with the Soviet Union. There's a reason why there was so much terrorism in Europe and South America in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then once the Soviet Union fell, a lot of that dissipated. So I think it's important to think about how that could now play out going forward. In the case of, I'll get into the case of Syria in particular more, but you see this with Afghanistan now, where the US is doing an over horizon approach, whereas governments like China, Russia, Iran, Turkey are legitimizing the Taliban regime, and of course they're harboring Al-Qaeda, as well as the fact that they're having a difficult time dealing with the Islamic State's province there. In the case of Mali, Burkina Faso, we see the French have withdrawn from the region. It looks like the United Nations is about to withdraw at the end of this month. Which has provided a space for Wagner or Russia to take advantage. Of course, there are a lot of questions related to the future of Wagner after what we saw this past weekend. But overall, as a consequence of the way they conduct war, it's provided a lot more violence against civilians and therefore opportunities for groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda to take advantage. And in the case of Mozambique, it has the third largest gas reserves in Africa, and as a consequence of IS's insurgency there, it's hurt that. And when you think about in the context of the supply issues from Russia and Ukrainian war, you could see how this all gets mixed together. So returning to Syria, where I think that a lot of this is going on in many ways, you see this nexus between sort of power competition to terrorism. For one, the Assad regime at the beginning of the uprising enabled jihadi actors by releasing them from prisons. This also goes back to what the regime did back during the heyday of the Iraq War, when the regime allowed foreign fighters to flow through its territories into Iraq. Then you have Iran building up its Shia proxy network with Lebanese Hezbollah, as well as Iraqi Shia militias, as well as others from Afghanistan and Pakistan. Then, of course, you have Turkey, who's an ally, working with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, a designated terrorist group in northwest Syria, or HTS for short, and previously looked the other way when tens of thousands of foreign fighters were streaming across the border and joining up with ISIS. And then even looking at our own selves, the United States, we've looked past sort of the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, historical associations with the PKK, the Kurdish terrorist group, which is designated by the US, which of course has created a ton of tensions with Turkey. Therefore, in many ways, a lot of what's playing out in Syria is likely to play out in other theaters in the future as well. Therefore, many of these actors continue to consider sort of terrorist groups as proxies constituting either part of their own statecraft or that of their adversaries. So I think it's important to recognize this when we're trying to think about this in a broader sense. If you look at the Islamic State in particular, which of course is sort of the biggest threat emanating from Syria, it is true that the group has been degraded. There's been less of a focus on it since they lost the territory there in March 2019. And the number of attacks in Syria have gone down from 1,055 claimed by IS in 2019 to only 297 last year. And so far this year, almost halfway through the year, it's about 55, so it'll be 110. So again, it's going down. But I think it's important to caveat this in that ISIS is suppressing the reality of its insurgency. It's not claiming every single attack it's conducting, especially in places like Dara in the southern part of the country and the Homs Desert, which is just west of where the US operates. Part of the reason is it doesn't want to make it seem like it's stronger than it is. And these are also areas where the Assad regime is dealing with the group, and thus it wants to take advantage of the fact that the regime is not very competent in dealing with ISIS, whereas the US and SDF has been a lot better in sort of suppressing the insurgency. Of course, it's not perfect though. One of the things that we've noticed over the last few years since they've lost territory is that they've still attempted to try and form some level of shadow governance in rural areas in Deir ez-Zor governorate, whether it's taxation, moral policing, still trying to release administrative documents and push in upon the local population. And in many cases, they sort of own the night. A lot of times the SDF withdraws from these areas once the sun goes down, and therefore IS is able to then extort people for this type of money or kill people, and so on and so forth. This then doesn't even get into the issue in Northeast Syria with the detention centers and IDP camps, which have an unknown number of men that remain in the IS prisons, and we've already seen IS attempting to break them out a number of times now. The biggest one about a year and a half ago now, at the Warrain prison. Then you have still around, 7,700 or so individuals that are third country nationals in the El Hol camp, about 2,200 in El Roj. And the pace of repatriation of these foreigners is very slow. Last year there were only 537 people repatriated. At that pace, it's going to take a number of years. And that doesn't even get into the fact that there's still about 18,000 Syrians detained or in these IDP camps who will likely not be returned because they're in Assad regime territory. So people worry about their safety. And then about 25,000 Iraqis. So there's a lot that the Iraqis could do to step up on this issue, in my opinion. One of the things I worry about the most is the US withdrawal scenario. We already saw that it is a possibility. In the last presidential administration, it was attempted twice, though stopped eventually by the bureaucracy as well as some other leadership in the government. Part of this is a consequence of people's continued push to talk about so-called endless wars, even though what is happening in Syria has really nothing to do with sort of what we saw in Iraq or Afghanistan previously, as well as the fact that it's an extremely light footprint and the US is primarily training and assisting there and advising. And because of this, I think our adversaries, especially Iran and its proxy network, are going to be continuously testing the US's resolve with these drone attacks or other types of attacks in eastern Syria. I also worry that because nothing super bad so far has happened as a consequence of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that people might be misapplying lessons from that. I think that's a misunderstood issue, since although we don't agree with the Taliban, they have been actively fighting ISIS, whereas the context in Syria is much different. They have a less interest in doing this because it helps their own strategic interests. I would say the withdrawal from Iraq in 2010 is more apt a comparison, though there are certain, contextual differences. Turkey now guards its borders. Local actors in Iraq, I think, are more willing to take on ISIS in a serious manner. But the reality is the Islamic State is waiting out the US, SDF, and the coalition. And if the US did decide to leave, I imagine that we would see a sort of reorganization of the group and possibly even take over territory again in eastern Syria, and therefore providing a base for itself to project attacks abroad again, because they have so many people that could potentially be led out of these prisons in northeast Syria. So I'll leave it at that for now. That's more of a localized approach. So I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zelin. Again, an excellent overview of the, I would say, most recent trends and developments as it relates to the safety and security issues in not only Syria and beyond as well. Thank you. I hope we could get into some of the great points you mentioned. Next up is Mr. David Cook from the SOAA. David served in the U.S. Army for a decade, beginning in the 82nd Airborne Division and later 4th Psychological Operations Group. Most recently, David served as National Security Advisor for a member of Congress. In addition to leading SOAA, David develops open source intelligence strategy and policy for the Department of Defense. Thank you, David. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just I'll build on some of Aaron's points here for a second. I think that we've been at war for 20 years, fighting the war on terror, and we've had this kind of geopolitical arbitrage that happened, and this perception that our retrenchment from the Middle East can be applied to state-on-state conflict, and that's just, it's not true. I think the biggest risk I think that we have, like Aaron said, is the withdrawal of American troops from the Middle East, and this growing sentiment within the U.S. population. I think of Congressman Matt Gaetz recently introduced a privilege resolution to get out of Somalia, get out of Syria. Nigeria will be next, I bet. And there's members of Congress on both sides of the aisle who are in support of this. I think we're just doing ourselves a disservice by applying the lessons learned from Afghanistan, Iraq to any future conflict. I think what we have to keep in mind, this perception of dusting off the Cold War playbook since Russia invaded Ukraine is wrong. Certainly there are lessons to be learned, but we're in a different era. And if you asked me last week about how we go about this, you think about military doctrine and tank squadrons and air superiority. Well, you asked me on Monday after this weekend's events, it would probably be better to watch The Godfather or ask the proverbial Tony Soprano about what's going to happen in Russia next, because the Wagner Group seems to me like they're consolidating power and going to go after Putin next. So, what am I saying here? The whole point is that we have to be very flexible. We have to, we can't apply past lessons to the future. Sure, we can anticipate, but the point is you can't take your eye off terrorism. You can't take your eye off the Middle East. And if you want to learn a lesson from history, the Middle East has been a linchpin in geopolitics for, I don't know, 5 centuries now, and how we've gone about warfare. And so, and I run the Special Operations Association of America. So obviously I'm biased towards special operations, and we've got a couple hundred troops in Somalia. We've got less than 1,000 in Syria, and we are force multipliers. We are the perfect people for this type of job, to maintain stability with a small footprint. And we need a better education program for members of Congress, the US population, and we need to send more soft troops out into those countries, which by the way, so a perfect caveat here. SOCOM, or Special Operations Command, has more than 4,000 troops deployed in more than 80 countries for the past 30 years doing this in country teams and in embassies around the world. This is our job. Not every solution is a military solution, but we're critical thinkers and we can make this happen. And we've done it all. And so I look forward to the discussion, and yeah, thanks.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that for your insight as well. Very, very important and great points as well. So again, the session is open for questions. Participants, you have any question, you're welcome to shoot it our way. Welcome to share that with our panelists as well. I have a few of my own, and of course, some that emerged during the course of the great presentations as well. Maybe to start off, we talked a little bit about the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, their current capabilities. We talked about how, like Aaron and Katherine also pointed out, they are degraded to a certain extent. We don't know how much the numbers, and they're really either not, I would say, we don't have much transparency, or the numbers are vague in many cases as well, but we know that they have been degraded. We get that information from the ground as well. That being said, we know that also there's a long-standing insurgency that's very active, especially in parts of Syria. And I believe yesterday or the day before yesterday, ISIS in Syria has been relatively kind of mute on the issue, but they released, I believe, as of March, this is one of the very first releases since March, of a video called "Makers of Epics," which is basically a very gore in the tradition of ISIS genre, how they're attacking the troops, Syrian SDF forces, beheadings, a lot of gore material as well. And then we also have gang violence in Northeast Syria, right? There's a lot of criminal activities happening there as well. We have external and internal sort of security threats that come from those detention camps, right? Camps. So Aaron, you mentioned there's thousands still that are in those camps across both men and women. So just to get a general sense of the where we heading with this as well, right? So, can we speak of what is the current presence strength of groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda? Can we quantify that as well? Can we also, again, I try to bundle some of the questions as well. If we look at if you look at some of the most recent developments as well, we know that specifically the SDF has most recently announced that they are going to try those who are within the detention centers based on their, I quote, international and local laws, counterterrorism laws as well. And that they sort of had this, at least initial seal of approval from some of the Arab countries as well. The West has been silent on the issue as well. So the question is, how do we address these challenges, right? So if they are to proceed, given the lack of, I would say, reluctance on many Western countries to repatriate those who are in detention centers as well. Should they proceed, right, to try those individuals? Will that affect in any way the relationship of the U.S. with the administration in Northeast Syria as well? Could that even potentially mean, again, I'm just hypothetically speaking, that it could also lead to the U.S., of course, kind of distancing themselves from their current involvement? Should the relationship with Assad, and we know as of recently, normalize as well? So any thoughts, again, that you may have? Again, I try to bundle these, are very interrelated questions, but I would like to hear from all of you. Katherine, you may, if you don't mind, going first.
I was going to let Aaron take that one first. I think as we're looking at the strength of Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, particularly in Syria, as Aaron noted, it's both groups have been degraded, and the Al Qaeda question is incredibly complex. So I will sideline that and leave it for Aaron to talk through kind of how that has developed. But it comes back to some of the challenges that we face on the policy side and the authorities side inside of Syria, where we have really had to focus our energy, so the special operators on the ground, on the high echelon threats within Syria. So the members of the senior leadership, the global senior leadership who base inside of Syria because they're able to find sanctuary there, and target them specifically. What that has done has left the kind of Syrian level command structure actually pretty intact, in ways that, yes, we're facilitating the SDF, who are counterterrorism partners on the ground, to be able to go after those members, but it's not a major priority for us. And what that does is kind of leave behind an element that is going to continue to provide sanctuary for the global leadership, which then serves to magnify the strength of the group beyond the actual number of individuals. I don't have the exact number of fighters estimated offhand on me for that theater. But as we kind of look elsewhere, right? I think globally, I did the math a couple months ago, so these numbers are dated. But as we're looking at Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, numbers wise, right? These groups are still significantly stronger than they were 8-10 years ago. And so even as we talk about them being degraded, the core elements that we're focusing on degrading are the external attack nodes, the nodes that are engaged in terrorism, in transnational activities, and not the elements that have so embedded into local conflicts that they are providing a base of support for those external actors to tag onto. And, I've been looking at Yemen now for 14 years, and AQAP is operationally on the ground at one of the weakest points that I've seen it. It's beginning to come back after a couple of years, but starting about 2018, 2019, the group was fundamentally disorganized. It couldn't carry out attacks. Its insurgency was almost a non-starter, and US and Emirati counterterrorism pressure had really reduced the external threat as well. The group even then had a factor of 10 more fighters than it did back in 2009 when it put a bomb on a plane to the United States. And that's something that I think that as we're looking at these challenges and talking about the numbers and the strengths of the groups, the number of fighters doesn't always reflect the threat of the group. And also kind of conversely and perversely, the number of fighters doesn't always reflect how many of the individuals who are fighting on behalf of the Islamic State or on Al Qaeda or the various affiliates that they have actually adhere to the radical ideology or are current bandwagoners because of what these groups are able to give them in the short term, which is an element that allowed the Islamic State originally, when it was still Al Qaeda, to come back inside of Iraq, and has continued to serve both groups incredibly well in being able to regenerate strength on the ground.
Thank you, Katherine. I appreciate that. Excellent insights. Dr. Zelin?
Yeah, it's there's just always been a lot of dynamics in Syria between what we've talked about with the CT fight related to ISIS, or sort of the drone campaign against Al Qaeda's leadership in Syria. And then on the other hand, you have Russia positioning itself to take advantage of its intervention in Syria to then project power on other actors in the Middle East, whether they parlay that into better relations with Egypt or the Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, and then even further down into Western Africa and the Sahel region. And then you have Iran with its continued project of regional hegemony, essentially. So while I spoke to mainly the consequence of potentially the US leaving and what that could mean for ISIS, it would also cede the region in many ways to Russia and Iran to do as they please. And while the US's political leadership continues to say that we're interested in being in the region and working with our allies, the perception on the ground is different just because they see the US more focusing on other issues. And of course, it makes sense that the US would be focusing a lot on what's happening in Ukraine vis-a-vis Russia, or what China is attempting to do in the Asia Pacific. But as David noted earlier, the Middle East is in between both areas of the world where you have these powers that are trying to sort of push against the US's quote unquote world order, as people call it. So I think that that's important to remember as well, since they'll use these Middle Eastern states to push back against the US's influence. And we're seeing this all the time now with the Chinese investments and signing of memorandums of understanding, and the fact that they're putting in ICTs in these countries that are linked up with Huawei, and what that means for 5G, let alone 6G, and how that then could sort of negate the potential for the US and the military to help out our allies there, because we're uncomfortable with linking up into those local networks that will then have access to potentially our own technology and secrets. So there are a lot of second and third order consequences to sort of only acting as if what's happening in Eastern Europe or Asia Pacific is relevant to power competition when it's happening in the Middle East too, even if it's not under the guise of a war. It's more, in the case of China, economic statecraft, whereas Russia is a bit more hard power, but they're doing it more of a lighter footprint, just because it's not like when they went into Afghanistan in the 1980s. So it's a complicated scene, and therefore the US needs to continue to focus on what's happening in Syria, because in many ways, everything that we've seen in the world over the last 10 years is a consequence of the failure of the US's leadership in Syria, because we understood what was actually happening there, whether it was in relation to Russia going in 2015, or whether it's Iran essentially really having this, so-called Shia crescent from its border to the Mediterranean, and how that then has played out elsewhere, which has squeezed the US in many ways and made it harder to maneuver. But if the US was a bit more proactive, I think it could provide some more semblance to our strategy, as well as shifting some of the power dynamics back more in the US's corner. But unfortunately, at least from what I see on both political parties, there really isn't much interest in it, because of sort of an understandable PTSD in many ways from what happened in Iraq. But that doesn't negate the reality on the ground either.
Thank you, Dr. Zelin. Just very briefly to kind of follow up on the previous question, it does have implications. We know that Syria, Turkey, Russia, and Iran again have started this sort of conversation to normalize relationship with Bashar. So we know with the Assad regime, so we know that potentially the normalization may not happen overnight, right? The situation is very complicated. Nevertheless, does pose the question: what does normalization mean for this counterterrorism policy for the U.S. going forward? What does it mean for the disputed territories in Syria nowadays that we have, or even thousands of third country detainees? What happens with them? Again, I know it's a complicated question. We don't know much about that, but if any of you again can share any light into your observations, would be good.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely can complicate things in the medium term for sure, because the U.S. is quote unquote not a country that was asked to help the Assad regime out like the Russians and the Iranians, and therefore the regime will say that the US is on its sovereignty essentially, and therefore that's why you'll see more cases where the Iranians will probably try and test the US by doing these potential drone strikes and other incursions into areas where the US and the SDF is fighting against ISIS, and therefore there's then the third order consequences of what this could mean if there is some, really bad attack, God forbid, of course, and what that could, play out politically in the domestic front, and how that then leads to the U.S. withdrawing, and then, that will open the doors for Turkey to be more aggressive against the SDF, and then the SDF will focus less on ISIS as well as the detainee population. And while all detainees might not get out of the prison, some might get released in the same way we saw some of them getting released in 2012 and 13 in Iraq, in the campaign then, and that would replenish some of the hardcore fighters of the group from the past decade. Or in the case of the IDP camps, you have the women and children, and therefore you have the next generation essentially, as well as not only sort of the insurgent aspect of ISIS and its movement, but also its state building project, where they do need people to help govern the territory if they did, take over territory again. So there's a lot of potential scenarios that could play out that could lead to this as a consequence of this normalization, because it legitimizes sort of Assad's claims on different areas of the country that he doesn't control now, even though the countries that are trying to normalize with Assad don't really have a solution to deal with Assad, who is the reason why there are these issues in the first place. I mean, if you look at the root causes of everything in Syria, it is the regime. Until the regime is gone, there will continue to be problems in the country, in my opinion. So that's something also I don't think people talk about enough.
Thank you, Dr. Zelin. Very interesting. Just a side fact, some data that came out of Iraq, a lot of the most recent recruits actually who are joining ISIS in any capacity, in insurgent capacity, tend to not to have any affiliation with ISIS. So we're talking about a new generation of wannabe or adherents of ISIS that creates a new layer of complexities compared to previous generations of fighters as well. Again, going into that ISIS's insurgent state building project that you already mentioned, which is really complicated. David?
Yeah, let's start the hard part first. The repatriation of the IDPs. I think, I don't really have a good answer, but Al Hol, I think itself, it has 75,000 or so people within it, and not enough attention has been paid to it. And Aaron's right. The regime stays. It's the regime has only strengthened recently, and without the U.S. and frankly probably you need NATO attention. Turkey is going to have to play a big role in this as well. But yeah, you're going to need an international cooperative to figure out where we're going to put all these people and how we're going to process it. And I mean, yeah, and as far as the strength of terror organizations, in Syria and across the Middle East, we've seen what happens when we take our foot off the gas. The second mission of Afghanistan was to deny the Taliban and Al Qaeda freedom of movement, right? And that's what we do. That's what the U.S. military and parts of the State Department do across the Middle East. I think about General Kurilla, Central Command commander, testified a couple months ago. He was asked how long would it take for Al Qaeda and Taliban or the Taliban, but to reconstitute and export terrorism. And he said about 6 months. So in less than 2 years after we left Afghanistan, Al Qaeda could export terrorism just like they did on 9/11. Now, things are different, but a U.S. presence and a strong U.S. and NATO cooperation in the Middle East to counter terrorism has to be continued, because otherwise, the Iranian proxies across the Middle East and Iraq and in Syria have grown, and in turn, there will be, weapons transfers. There's going to be, their interests are aligned, and we can't take our eye off this.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that. Great points. Again, both repatriation and the threat and the lessons, I should say, learned from Afghanistan as well. We understand the repatriation is really not risk-free, but countries have demonstrated, again, looking into best practices on how to mitigate certain risks of those who return. So there's a lot that countries can potentially learn from when it comes to repatriating as well. And I think some are working more diligently than the others. Do want to extend courtesy to our respective participants, viewers. We have a few questions. So the first, apologize. The first one is about Dr. Zelin. Says, my current situation in Afghanistan is not good. So Taliban is ruling in the country, but when it will be possible for international community to recognize Taliban as a legitimate government in Afghanistan?
Yeah, it's definitely a interesting question. If you actually look at the Taliban's rule thus far, it's almost, of course, 2 years now since they took the country again. If you look at it diplomatically, although they haven't been recognized by the United Nations as the government of Afghanistan, more than 40 countries are actively, meeting with the Islamic Emirate, for lack of a better way of describing it, since that's what they call their government, over the last 2 years. In particular, you have countries like China and Turkey that are probably the two biggest countries. One obviously is our largest adversary right now, and another is one of our allies. Although they haven't been officially recognized by the UN, I would say that they are an accepted government by most of the key players on the world stage now, even if there are, of course, issues with them from the US's perspective, whether it's their continual harboring of, Al-Qaeda operatives. There was recently a report that the UN put out saying that some of the leaders in the government now are from Al-Qaeda and in different provinces of the country. And of course, almost a year ago now, the US killed Ayman al-Zawahiri, and the Taliban still gaslighting everybody, essentially saying that this didn't happen, even though there's, of course, evidence from the US's perspective. And Al-Qaeda, of course, itself has been quite mum about this and trying to pretend like it didn't happen either. So long as the Taliban tries to act in this manner, there will always be concerns, even from the countries that have engaged with them. I mean, even China and Russia and Turkey, as well as, Central Asian states, India, even though they want to do business with the Taliban, because, one of the things to remember is that Afghanistan has a ton of rare earth metals and other resources. So people do want to do business there. The issue is that, there's still a worry about security threats, and ISIS has, directly attacked diplomatic facilities of the Russians and the Chinese, continue to go after the Shia population in Afghanistan, as well as, other enemies that they deem, quote unquote, un-Islamic. And although the Taliban has degraded ISIS locally in comparison to its campaign a couple of years ago, as a consequence of this, IS in Afghanistan is actually focused more on external operations abroad too. So they've sort of taken up the mantle of IS in Iraq and Syria, whereby not only are they producing propaganda materials in the local languages, Pashto and Urdu, but also in Farsi and English. But they've plotted attacks abroad, not just these cross-border attacks with Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, but also there have been a number of plots in India and Kashmir, in Iran. There was the attack in Iran last fall. And then there's been a number of plots in Turkey, and there's actually been 2 plots in Germany. So it's not just a regional thing. The fact is that they're trying to plot in the West as well. So imagine if they do execute a successful attack in Europe or the United States or wherever, what will that mean then for the Taliban? They continue to try and push these various lines that Afghanistan will not be a territory used for external terrorism or something along those lines. But what happens when that actually happens in the real world? That will put them in a very uncomfortable position. And what was interesting is that there wasn't that much backlash to the fact that the U.S. killed Zawahiri in, Siraj ad-Din al-Khani's flat, essentially. I would think that other countries might have not sort of engaged with them as much as a consequence. But if you actually compare the number of diplomatic engagements of the Taliban regime between August 15th, 2021 to 2022 versus 2022, August 15th up through now, there's actually been more over the last 10 months leading up to the 2-year anniversary. So there really hasn't been any deterrent. So it would be quite interesting if ISKP was able to conduct some larger scale attack like what we saw in Paris or Brussels. Obviously, I don't want that to happen, but they could be put on their back heel pretty quickly if something big happened like that.
Thank you, Dr. Zelin. I hope the viewer found the question satisfactory as I have, and the most of the panelists have. We have one more question from the panelists, but maybe before we go that, I have one more question of my own as well. So, Katherine, this is would be good if you could maybe take a stab at this one, and I want to piggyback on the article that you wrote recently about the state of the counterterrorism partnerships, right? As far as the Middle East, you raised some great points. You talk about why are they needed precisely in a moment in time? How do we benefit from them? How have we neglected the sort of counterterrorism partnerships vis-a-vis Syria and other places as well? And maybe try to juxtapose that with the existing current Biden administration's counterterrorism policy, over the horizon policy, if you will, where we do not necessarily have permanent bases, but we have forward deployed forces. We basically act when there is a need. We don't have physical presence per se, and that's a policy that's being applied not only to Syria and other places as well. Maybe this could be, I understand, reprioritizing. It's okay when it comes to national security and counterterrorism, but at the same time, how do we come to the terms that Al-Qaeda and ISIS are also growing in strength, as we have discussed, at least by some measures we discussed earlier as well? How do we, again, bring those or bridge those together? Maybe you could have Katherine and David answer this too, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's a far-reaching question, and as we're looking particularly in the Middle East, we still have some very strong counterterrorism partners on the ground. When you're kind of looking around the region, the US, the UAE are partnered in terms of countering Al-Qaeda inside of Yemen. Saudi Arabia also contributes to that partnership. And the US has supported the Saudi-led effort to pull together a regional counter-threat financing organization, which has set in motion some of the asks that the United States and other partners have been asking for a while now, in terms of reducing the amount of Gulf money that will go into the pockets of the Islamic State or Al-Qaeda. We also have great partners inside of Jordan, the Iraqi security forces as well, and then the Syrian defense forces, who have been good partners on the ground, but have a lot of problems just in terms of their longevity for the United States, because of the political challenges of their interests, because of how Turkey sees them, and of course, because of the challenge with the Assad regime. And I'm glossing over some others that are enduring too in the region. When we're looking at the value of those partnerships, policymakers talk about them in terms of what do we get from them? What does the threat look like? What's the threat reduction? And how does this affect our counterterrorism interests? But what they often forget to ask is how it advances American relationships across the board with those partners that extends much farther than the counterterrorism realm. It's not just that we have Americans partnered directly with the special operations forces in Jordan or the Emirates or Iraq, but also that those relationships become enduring, that the liberal values that our troops bring with them are exposed to our partners. If not adopted, they at least understand our values and understand some of the positions that we're coming from. And I think one of the bigger issues or advantages of having our counterterrorism partnerships is that it puts us on the ground next to other militaries, other partners, at times when we might not be there if we were to do it purely based on threat resourcing. And it gives us a perspective on the region that allows us to understand other developments unrelated to counterterrorism, which is invaluable for the United States. I think the kind of idea that this is a forever war, one that Aaron referenced earlier, is just wrong. Our operators are participating in activities that advance American interests and keep Americans secure. They are helping our partners in advancing our partners' security as well. And this is not, the US is not on war footing with regard to the counterterrorism threat. David can talk much more about this in depth, but fundamentally, our special operators are enablers. They bring some certain capabilities that only the United States can bring, that then takes the local partners and allows them to operate with better intelligence and precision and to maneuver against their enemies in a much more efficient fashion. In addition to, I would say, being able to shine a light on challenges with human rights abuses and other humanitarian concerns that otherwise we just don't have visibility on or can't bring to the surface. So, the idea that I've been pushing for is, I obviously believe that we should be transforming how we frame the challenge from the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda generally, but short of that, we need to understand the benefits outside of counterterrorism that these counterterrorism relationships give us. If you look inside of the Syrian conflict, our forces were there and are there to fight the Islamic State. We had a very discreet mission against the high-level Al-Qaeda senior operatives that were based in northwest Syria, but it also put us in the middle of a very contested space, as both Aaron and David noted, between Russia, between Iran. Also, the Israelis are trying to keep some of the Iranian activities off of the Israeli border as well, and keeping the Turks from pursuing Turkish interests in a way that would be fundamentally further destabilizing to the region. So there is a benefit just in having the short of 1,000 American troops on the ground inside of Syria beyond the security dynamics. Same thing is occurring down in Yemen, where we still have a handful of special operators who are working next to the Emiratis, keeping an eye on Al-Qaeda in Yemen, which has continued to pursue its external threat capabilities. And that also puts us in a space where it's not the perfect space to watch some of the expeditious Iranian behavior, just because the Al-Qaeda, the counterterrorism fight and the counter-Iranian efforts are just geographically different inside of the Yemen theater. But it puts us inside of Yemen in places where we might not otherwise be, and actually on part of the smuggling rat lines that bring the Iranian weapons to the Houthis. So it gave us a little bit more visibility on a challenge that we fundamentally should have recognized back in 2019, 2020, when the Iranians were developing it inside of Yemen with the Houthis as one that would change security dynamics. And that is now being employed by the Russian military inside of Ukraine, because the Iranians were really able to prove this use case with the Houthis in terms of exporting those capabilities. So, all of that is nothing to do with a plot that's being, pursued by Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State against the United States. And then the last key point, and it circles back to the role of the United States in the Middle East and I would say the world. We are a superpower. The U.S. has been a security guarantor in the Middle East for past 50 years, and that shifted about 10 years ago when the United States began signaling that it was pulling away and pivoting to Asia, rebalancing, however you want to frame it. There was this idea that the United States was going to pull back and to further enable local powers to pursue their own interests and maintain their own security. The challenge is that the delicate balance of power in the Middle East that has kept the region, we think of it as incredibly in turmoil, but there have not been a lot of interstate conflicts in the Middle East. This has been internal state dynamics since the United States was able to step in and provide that security. As the US is pulling back on the counterterrorism front as well from the Middle East, our partners are wondering whether the US will step up should something happen. If Iran does something against the Gulf states or Israel, will the United States take the correct action, the partners' perceived correct actions to defend them? And there's this hedging that's been ongoing. There's a lot been written about it, but it's part of the reason why we're seeing the introduction or re-emphasis on relations with Russia, with China, and with other powers that can contribute to the national security of our Gulf and Arab partners on the ground.
Thank you, Katherine. Appreciate putting things into context and by means of great examples as well. Appreciate. David, very briefly, could we fight terrorists from afar? Is that enough? Again, do we have to have this sort of permanent base as opposed to just forward deployed forces to fight the emerging threats?
Very shortly, no. So there's this saying I was thinking about as Katherine was going through it in the Gulf. It's I hear it used a lot in Yemen. Nothing is for sale and everything is for rent. And so if you look at what the Biden administration has done and what it said, for one, let's be honest, they got lucky with Zawahiri in Afghanistan with the over the horizon capabilities. But we came up with this great idea, the Abraham Accords, that galvanized the Middle East together. And I think the Biden administration has effectively forgotten about it. And then the attempt to restart the Iran nuclear deal flopped on its face, and now I'm reading they've enriched uranium up to 60%. Their proxies are stronger than they've ever been, and that's not good. And I was in Syria when Trump said we were going to pull out, and we had very difficult conversations with our SCF partners. And the days following, they would ask, we live with them, by the way. Like they weren't a couple clicks away. We live with them, right? So we didn't know how they were going to react. And the conversations in the days and the weeks that followed were, they would ask, when are you going to leave? And we were honest with them and said, we have no idea. But you know what? We're right here in front of you. We're going out on missions with you. And, I would question sometimes what we were actually doing with, in the stability operations and civil councils. But it dawned on me one day, there aren't too many armored Toyota Hiluxes that roll around Syria. And when we would always drive through a village, all the kids and people would cheer and wave, and that's why we were there. Our presence is a signal that we are there.
Thank you, David. Appreciate that. I wish I had 10 more hours with you to kind of dig into a lot of great questions. I'm assuming that's a reciprocal kind of feeling as well. So a few questions. So we have one more from the audience, and I want to be respectful of the audience. So one question from the audience is there a way to delegitimize Salafi jihadist ideology and defeat the Islamic State without making it advantageous for Iran?
I guess I'll jump on that one if that's okay, Ardian.
Yes, Katherine, please.
I think the short answer is yes. The draw of Salafi jihadi ideology today has only been increased by the conflicts and the radicalization processes that have occurred on the battlefield, and that's in part driven by Iranian actions, of course, but a lot of it is driven by the local conflicts, the various power struggles between different actors, the access to resources, the fundamental human search for dignity and a future that is really at the heart of what individuals do when they make a choice. And to me, it's less about counter messaging and teaching about how extreme Salafi jihadism is. It's as a religious ideology, it's actually incredibly foreign to most Muslims. And for those who believe in fundamentalist ideas within Islam, the marriage of those ideas to the violent creed that both Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State put together makes it almost heretical and heretical in some cases, depending on who you're talking to. But what that means is that if the US were simply to pull back from this focus on the ideology and understand why individuals are turning to Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State, and to help ameliorate the various conditions on the ground that are creating the opportunities for these groups to recruit, to tap into the local insurgencies, or to provide the enabling capabilities that a suicide bomber or an individual trained in explosives can provide to a fight, we would actually see, in my belief, a huge reduction in the strength of these groups. The reason why they've come to dominate certain spaces is not because their ideology is resonant. It's because they have tied their short-term interests to local narratives and local grievances that enable them to bring people in to fight alongside them. Some of those individuals become radicalized, but many are simply foot soldiers who get paid, who are able to help their families, provide justice for their families, or defend their villages. And that is something that, it's addressing those issues actually hurts Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and Iran, because the way that Iran has been able to enter these spaces as well is through some of those very same cleavages within populations.
Thank you, Katherine. Appreciate your answer. Very briefly, we have less than 5 minutes left, and I'll try to again sort of bring these two questions together. And if you're okay, if you just answer it with yes or no. So the first question, also, which is the crux of a lot of discussion today, is Ukraine, the current Ukraine-Russia war, standing in the way of our priorities when it comes to the counterterrorism policy in the Middle East? Again, yes or no, you're just fine. Secondly, we talked about Wagner earlier. Yesterday, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov announced that Wagner is going to continue its operations in Mali, in some other, I believe in Central Asia as well, in some places as well, under the authority of supposedly their MOD, right, Ministry of Defense as well. The question that I have is, does the potential withdrawal of Wagner from these Syria and other places as well create this sort of potential for the US and its partner to regain influence in those areas as well? Again, yes or no, just perfectly fine. If I could have a minute from each one of you, would be great. Katherine?
I don't know if I'm going to remember all of these. Yes, I think that Ukraine is distracting from the counterterrorism fight, not because it should be, but because of how we're approaching the Ukraine problem set and creating this binary concept in terms of competing with China and confronting Russian threats. The last one was on the Wagner Group's withdrawal. I don't remember the middle one. And, I think, we certainly should be prepared to exploit the weaknesses that this weekend's events showed in terms inside of Russia, as well as the spaces that are opening up on the ground as Wagner pulls back. Yes, it seems though, however, that we weren't ready for that for some reason, that the planning wasn't there to set in motion US activities. Maybe I just haven't seen them, but I think that that's something that we should be looking to capitalize on broadly.
Thank you, Katherine. Dr. Zelin?
I agree. I don't think Ukraine is distracting from the CT fight in the Middle East in of itself, but more that there's sort of, like I said, a bifurcation between power competition and CT. Even though I think a lot of it's intertwined. In terms of the Wagner Group, I mean, just yesterday or 2 days ago, Russia was bombing civilians in northwest Syria. So whether Wagner is there or it's just the usual MOD of Russia and their regular military, they're going to continue to kill civilians in Syria either way, unfortunately. And the US would be wise to try and push back against it.
Thank you, Dr. Zelin. David?
Yeah, agreed. Let's see. I remembered the second question. If the Wagner Group pulls out of other places in Africa or even Syria, would terrorists or would other groups kind of fill the vacuum? I think yes. And I think President Putin had much broader plans. I was watching the Wagner Group in Africa and Syria during the Russian invasion, and the Wagner Group was plussing up. They weren't pulling back. And so I don't know what the numbers are now, but I think all that's scuttled for good reason. As far as, this is it's a definitional problem. The Wagner Group are terrorists. So let's, we can just call them terrorists. I know I worked on this a little bit in Congress on nominating them as terrorists, and there are reasons why we shouldn't and why we should. But, look at what, again, last week they're bombing and killing civilians for a political end. I'm pretty sure that fits any definition of terrorism that you want to use. I forget the first question, but
You kind of answered it. We have to organize a new webinar. Thank you, Dave. Appreciate that. So thank you so much. So the first question was, again, does the ongoing Russia-Ukraine or commitment towards Russia-Ukraine war affect our priorities and response when it comes to counterterrorism policy in the Middle East and Syria specifically? Thank you again to all of you. We've come to a close. I want to be respectful of your time as well. It's been a really pleasure to have you, Ms. Katherine Zimmerman, Dr. Zelin, Mr. Cook as well. Again, this has been a great experience, and we look forward to continuing our webinar series with SOAA. Please watch out for the second one, where we will be discussing about the war in Ukraine, looking at the role of governments, nonprofit, international organizations in supporting Ukraine's urgent needs, addressing the impact of war and supporting the long-term development goals as well. The third webinar will look into the counterterrorism and artificial intelligence, examining the artificial intelligence exploitation by terrorists and the role that AI can have in the counterterrorism through a multilateral and bilateral organizations and meaningful partnerships as well. Again, on behalf of SOAA and ACTRI, I extend my appreciation to all of you for agreeing to speak and be with us today. For all the participants who've been so kind enough to follow with the questions as well, I'm hoping that we are going to have a section of the portion of the video shared with our audiences as well. Please follow us on our social media platforms, and we look forward to our future webinars. Thank you.